This past spring, my sisters and I were finally forced into the situation where we had to move my mother into assisted living. Now, of course, if you were to ask her, it was entirely unnecessary. After living 7 years with Alzheimer's that has been remarkably slow in its progression, we felt that it was no longer safe for her to live by herself. My father had died a little more than 6 years ago, and therefore we were faced with the prospect of moving her from a 2,500 square foot home into a 700 square foot apartment. Clearly, we couldn't move everything. So we had to decide what was important to her and what was not. Her grandmother's sewing machine was definitely an important keepsake for her. As far as I know, it still works, but it'll probably never be used for its intended purpose again. In fact, in the days when my mother still sewed, she used a different machine, a little more up-to-date one. Nevertheless, it was something that had a lot of meaning for her. So, along with her, it was going to go. Now, beyond the sewing machine, we had a tough time to decide what had meaning for her and what just simply had to go. Now, perhaps Sue and I should start getting rid of the things we don't need or don't have value. On the other hand, I suppose we could leave it for our sons to deal with. It'd kind of be sweet revenge for all those teenage years that they put us through. Parents, you know, if you've raised teenagers, you know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah, we won't do that. I'm sure we'll do things before they have to. It seems to me that we have a lot of stuff. And when we moved into our home, we put a lot of the things that we didn't need in the basement. So it makes me wonder, are we behaving like this man who is in our parable, in Jesus' parable? Perhaps not. We don't have a storage unit or a shed, and we're certainly not willing to move to a bigger house so that we can keep all of our stuff and perhaps get more. We have enough. And like many of you, it's time to downsize. Enough is enough. And now on these rare occasions when I go out and I buy some clothes, I make myself get rid of a similar article. If it's in good condition, I donate it. But like most of you, I have more than enough. Often it is thought that this parable is about wealth and accumulating wealth, and to a small degree, that is true. But more than that, Jesus' parable is about relationships, isolation, and even fear. Notice this man is quite self-satisfied for several reasons. First, he has a problem, and it's a good one at that. A problem which I'm sure he thinks came about because of his personal skills and abilities. As Jesus tells the parable, though, what does he say? He says, the land of a rich man produced abundantly. Clearly, Jesus is not giving credit for the bumper crop to the rich man that God had created, or the land that God had created. The wealthy are so often impressed with their accomplishments, even when the honor clearly belongs elsewhere. This man is only too happy to say, it was me, all me. I'm the only one who could have made this happen. After such a blessing, notice that he says, I have no place to store my crops. If you think about it logically, if this harvest was so large that he needed bigger barns, not just one more barn, but several more bigger barns, there is absolutely no way that he could have planted and cared for and gathered so much grain all by himself. Yet this man never stops to consider those who labored on his farm, that they might have had something to do with this abundance. Another reason he's so self-satisfied is he came up with a plan of action all by himself. Again, notice though, he never thinks to stop and ask God for direction. The farmer hatches his plan and is about to make it happen with the grim reaper knocking at his front door. Notice also his conversation. Notice who is included. He includes nobody. No one at all. Not even God is involved in this conversation. His conversation is only with himself. It's about himself and only himself. Never once does he stop to consider or think of his neighbors or his kin, his workers, or even his community. He rationalizes to himself, I'm sure, of course, they don't deserve to benefit from all this abundance. After all, they have to work just as hard as he did if they want to reap a similar reward. His extent of thought is no bigger than a pinpoint. And the sphere of his influence of his life does not go beyond himself. It is that narrowly defined. He has no consideration of others. Or as it might be said, he has no horizontal dimension to his life. The needs of others never even begin to factor into his plans. And Jesus says of him, he has no richness in his relationship to God. He never stops to consider any connection to the vertical dimension of life. He cannot even conceive of any relationship to God. You know, it's amazing how when it comes to the human heart and faith, so little has changed. Many wealthy today are no different than this man in the parable. I have had the chance or whatever to interact with some extremely wealthy people. Some have been quite generous. They don't talk, they act. But others I have known are afraid of relationships. They worry somebody might want to be friends just because of their money. Therefore, they push people away, even family. And they just cannot take the risk of trusting. Yes, this parable is a bit about wealth, but it's far more about community versus his isolation. Consider again the little conversation he has with himself, and only with himself. There's no evidence that there's anyone else in his life, anyone else he should care about, anyone else who might have contributed or benefited from this amazing harvest. Instead, confronted with all the abundant blessings that he has, all he can think about is what he should do to make sure he gets the most out of it so that he can live comfortably into his old age. Because of this blatant narcissism, the farmer believes the myth that he can secure his own future, the myth that he needs no one, depends on no one, and can go it alone. This is why God calls him foolish, because in the end comes death, but he will die alone, and all that he has stored up will not comfort or even begin to protect him. It may go to others who never loved or respected him. Whether they put it into good use or not, he'll never know. It might as well turn into dust and blow away in the wind. In this light, I wonder how we should read the closing line that Jesus says here. So it will be with all those who store up treasures for themselves and are not rich toward God. How can one be rich toward God also? And quite frankly, first, without being rich towards others. Martin Luther said this: God needs neither our good works nor our wealth, but our neighbor does. Let me say that again. Martin Luther said that God does not need our good works. God does not need our wealth, but our neighbor does. So perhaps this parable really is about community, the community in which we find sustenance and comfort and help and hope, and the community in which and through we experience life with God. Keep in mind, after all, this parable started with a break in community. The central and primary community in society, a family. One brother comes to Jesus seeking Jesus' intervention in a family squabble about inheritance. And Jesus will have none of it, recognizing that this should have been an occasion for celebration, remembrance, and gratitude, the giving and sharing of an inheritance. Instead, it has been turned into a moment of division. Jesus refuses to get involved directly, but instead tells the story of a man so enraptured with his good fortune that he ends up all alone. So who is Jesus addressing? The man who brought the complaint? The man's brother? The disciples? The crowds? All of us today? Yes, all of those are true. Yet of all of these possibilities, there's one I'm most interested in, and that's how we hear Jesus' words to us today. There is, as late, a profound and growing message in our society that we should not and we cannot trust each other, that the world is increasingly dangerous and therefore we should be increasingly afraid. That kind of fear will return us to the Dark Ages. The regular and relentless biblical injunction throughout both the Old and New Testament alike are these 4 words: do not be afraid. It's not offered simply to bolster our individual courage, but to make it easier for us to turn to one another with our fears and hopes and dreams in order to form a community. The Bible warns us against fear because it's really hard to care for your neighbor and create community when you are afraid. Don't get me wrong. Community is not easy. It really isn't. It means putting up with people who disagree with you and even annoy you, and perhaps have even hurt you. Forgiveness as well as trust is vital. But this is God's will, that we not be alone. We see that at the very beginning of Genesis in chapter 2. After God has created Adam, what does he say? He says, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make a partner for him." And I think this farmer, who was rich in possessions but absolutely dirt poor in relationships, never figured out this message, that God created you and me to live in community. And that, yes, in spite of what Cain asked God, am I my brother's keeper? The answer is yes. Amen.